You're live.
Welcome to Slow News Day Live. I'm Steve Boykinen. I'm here in yet half burnout Boulder Creek, California. I am joined by my better than your co-host, Glory Jones. What's happening, Glory?
I'm excited.
Are you? That's good. I'm glad. Makes it easier for me. I don't have to carry the show. Just kidding, Jones. I'm kidding, Jones. I'm kidding. I love you. We are joined by Dr. Piers Robinson. You have more credentials and qualifications, I think, than like anyone that's been on this show so far. And we've had some fairly well credentialed individuals, but my goodness, I had your bio up too. I did. Oh, and then I changed it because I was looking at a different article. That's right. There it is. You're the co-director for the Organization for Propaganda Studies and convene the working group on Syria, propaganda, and media. And you've done work with the working group on propaganda and the 9/11 global war on terror. You had an excellent review of 7, which I hope to talk about. And I'm going to shut up for a moment. Dr. Piers Robinson, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Steve, and very pleased to be on your show.
Your work in terms of disseminating narrative management, I think is fundamental for people to understand. I don't know, more broadly, like how propaganda works, what it does, and and how to spot it. I was wondering if we could, because one of the things that we like to do here when we get a chance is kick Bellingcat always. And we were just talking about that before we went live. How even as expansive as Bellingcat's narrative management operation is, goodness, they're just a bit player in all of this. And I think that it'll be fun to explore that because Elliot Higgins, I think, thinks that he is, well, King Turd of Shit Mountain, and he's just not.
Yeah, proudly blocked by Elliot Higgins.
Yeah.
That's one of my proudest blocks ever.
Me too. So I don't know if you want to take a swing at that, but just for the viewers who may not know, if they're new to the show, if they haven't, we do have a lot of new people coming to the show, which is awesome and welcome. What exactly is Bellingcat, and what is their function largely within this media sphere?
Well, kind of broader, interesting question about the way propaganda operates, I think, in contemporary Western democracies, is that there's been this emergence of, in a sense, this kind of outsourcing of propaganda activities to NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to contractors, and so on. So if people think of propaganda, they think of propaganda being generated by governments and states and so on. That, you know, in recent years, there has been this increasing focus on using NGOs, using private companies to basically shape narratives. And this is something which I think Bellingcat needs to be understood in the context of, because on the one hand, you know, that they're an apparently independent group, a civil society, non-governmental organization, a blogger who starts to investigate alleged war crimes in Syria and so on, and then builds up a reputation and a following. And the understanding that most people have of the organization is that it's completely independent of governments, independent of the state and so on. And that's certainly the way they're presented in the books and in the mainstream media reporting of them. But what they're actually doing, they're not actually fully independent of Western governments, neither in funding terms nor in terms of their linkages and communication flows. And so what you have is you have a very effective way of disseminating a narrative, because governments are no longer having to, as it were, sort of rely upon official briefers in order to sort of get the message out, which people might not trust, especially when it comes to foreign policy. They can instead rely upon these bodies which appear to be independent but aren't actually fully independent to get the narrative out, and they're more persuasive. And I think Bellingcat sits within that broader kind of array of propaganda apparatus, which are very important in terms of shaping understandings and perceptions. I mean, there is a big. I just finished reviewing a book on the Middle East, and it talks quite a lot about the rise of contractors and private contractors to control PR. So governments are using these private contractors, and you actually see this in the case of Syria with a particular kind of Incostrat, which was set up in 2015, private company, albeit run by a former British military commander, but it's still a private company. But they ended up providing PR support to some of the opposition groups in Syria. Okay, and that kind of outsourcing of propaganda activities, which I think sort of organizations such as Bellingcat effectively become a part of, is a very big part of how propaganda operates today in contemporary democracies. So your point about how do we spot propaganda, well, one of the things that people need to wise up to is that, you know, governments, it's not so much those military press briefers or government officials who are pushing the propaganda out. It's these other organizations which appear to be neutral and separate from government, but they're not really, which are really an important part of getting the message out. And that's one of the things that people need to wake up to. Unfortunately, with Bellingcat, it appears that most of the mainstream media haven't realized that one yet, even though it doesn't take an awful lot of searching to sort of at least raise an eyebrow about sort of where they sit and so on in terms of major foreign policy issues. But of course, most of the mainstream media have been quite happy to celebrate Bellingcat as this wonderful force for democracy, even though I noticed Stefania pointed out that the Bellingcat has stolen the WikiLeaks emblem, haven't they? Or they've changed it slightly.
Yes.
It's an intelligence agency, not of the people, which of course WikiLeaks, but an intelligence agency for the people.
Yeah.
I think you can read quite a lot into that.
I do. So Stefania is a friend of the show, and when she gets feisty, oh my gosh, we're like, I just come look, because she's so brilliant, and watching her pick apart not just Elliot personally, but everything that Bellingcat is and does, and comparing and contrasting that to what WikiLeaks is and does. You can, I mean, in terms of levels of integrity, like there's Stefania Maruzzi, way down there is Elliot Higgins, but I don't know, man, the authority with which Stefania speaks made that thread all the more entertaining for me, and the takedown, and of course Elliot Higgins, you know, eventual blocking of her and running away, and it was delicious. It was. I was going to bring that up. Our friend Mo, I believe, interviewed you for Sputnik right after that happened. Mohammed Almazi.
Yes,
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah. Lots been happening as for everyone. But yes, that's correct.
And you have a brilliant Twitter thread, which I'm gonna link in the Rockfin chat in a bit here. Basically just dissecting the whole shit show that is Elliot Higgins's book that was recently released. And one of the things that you point out is how not mentioned in that book is the full extent of the corruption within the OPCW, and how they suppressed a toxicology report with the Duma false flag that essentially concluded that the symptoms described were not consistent with those that would have happened under chlorine gas. And that was something not mentioned in Elliot Higgins' book. So I was just wondering if you could go kind of more in depth into how Bellingcat has been really a main actor in trying to suppress and go along with the corruption in the OPCW as it pushes for more regime change narratives in Syria, because that's one of the more recent happenings that we've seen with Bellingcat with regards to them being complicit with Western imperialism.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important part of the Bellingcat stroke Elliot Higgins story is the question of alleged chemical weapons attacks in Syria. And if there's any journalist out there who's worth his or her salt, they should be going back to 2013 and going through the social media output of Bellingcat and Elliot Higgins to start to piece together what's been going on. But what we have with the OPCW and Bellingcat is that we know that Bellingcat have been considered an important source of information for the OPCW. I won't go into the details of what level that is at, but they have been. So you've had a situation where you've had information being passed to the OPCW, which in a sense is directed where they deploy investigation teams to. And so in a sense, it almost an agenda setting role. And remember, Bellingcat is this open source, apparently independent organization feeding information and that getting into the OPCW and then having an impact on where the OPCW goes in terms of investigations in Syria. And then the other side to this role that they've been playing is in a sense, as well as constructing this kind of information, sort of an information train, going to the OPCW, but also producing their own reports and making claims about chemical weapons attacks and then publishing them, etc. The other side that we have seen in relation to the OPCW scandal is that when OPCW persons started to whistleblow and get information out, primarily people who'd been involved in the investigation of an alleged attack at the Duma, information started to come out that the investigation had been nobbled or it had been corrupted within the OPCW. When those whistleblowers, very courageously, at great risk, raised the issue, and various people within the organization, and there are a number of people in the organization who facilitated this, getting information out, the role of Bellingcat then was to start to smear the scientists. Okay, so this open source intelligence agent actually publishing and producing material which is trying to discredit the scientists in question. And with Elliot Higgins doing this online on a routine daily basis, etc., through his style on Twitter, but also with Bellingcat producing reports trying to discredit the whistleblowers. And then, as you probably know, because this came out as Aaron Mate and the Grey Zone published this, Bellingcat leaked a letter which they claimed was sent from the Director General to an inspector. And it was a letter that was never actually sent. It was sent in a very different form, but Bellingcat thought it was actually sent in that form, or they either knew or they didn't know. It was not possible to tell. But they published that, and that was a clear attempt to discredit one of the OPCW scientists. And so, what any normal person, any objective person would do in that situation is to say, what's going on here? Why is this organization actually working to smear extremely reputable, extremely experienced scientists from an organization who are raising very clear and very well articulated questions and issues about the investigation? And so they're performing the role of essentially smear merchants. And so you've got what starts to appear to be a very interesting operation where you have Bellingcat is important in terms of feeding information which gets to the OPCW and also feeding information out about alleged chemical weapons attacks. And then when you have people in these organizations actually starting to raise questions, Bellingcat go in on the attack and they tried to smear and discredit. They did this with Ted Postel, the American professor who raised questions about one of the earlier attacks. They've done it in relation to earlier alleged chemical weapons attacks, where you start to see scientists or people raising questions about what's going on, and they'll go straight in and start attacking them on social media. That's not rational, objective analysis or science. That says all the hallmarks of a propaganda operation. So you keep feeding the right information out into the public domain. When people start to question that, you try and shut those people down, and quite aggressively. I mean, with Stefania, Bellingcat and Higgins were jumping on her when she reported on the Courage Foundation panel, which heard testimony from an OPCW person. And you see the same way. I don't think he's been particularly pleasant to me over the years on one or two occasions, but you saw this with Ted Postel. If you've ever seen, or your viewers should go to see it, the Centre for Investigative Journalism in Britain hosted an event where Ted Postel was set up against Elliot Higgins in order to debate the chemical weapons issue. And you watch the debate and you'll see how Elliot Higgins operates. There's another thing to do about the debate is that the people who hosted the debate and then another organization who helped Elliot Higgins were all connected. Okay, so James Harkin of the Centre for Investigative Journalism, who chaired that event, was connected with Forensic Architecture, who were helping Elliot Higgins. And it was basically, it was a setup to try and trash Ted Postel in a public forum. They didn't succeed because Ted stayed calm and rational. But there's a point in this where you see Elliot Higgins and his body posture, and he's finger jabbing at Postel. That is not science. It's not rational analysis of any kind. It's all the hallmarks of a propaganda operation, and that's what you've got with Bellingcat.
Well, and it goes further than that, because Bellingcat will report something, or Elliot Higgins will like publicly fill his diaper on Twitter, and then a number of establishment media outlets will jump on that and report exactly what Bellingcat has suggested, not with any like facts to back it up, but just the narrative that they want to put forward. And a bunch of establishment media outlets will come in, repeat that narrative unquestioningly, and then that becomes reality to the larger public, and then we're left to go, okay, but no, and here's why, and we have actual information to support what we're saying, and no, it's not conspiracy just because you didn't hear it from the outlet that you go to for confirmation bias.
Yeah, and do you know the other thing I mean, sort of the way I talk about it sometimes, you know, and smiling, and we smile about Bellingcat. I mean, these are incredibly serious issues, because the point you raised earlier about the toxicology report, the essentially suppressed NATO toxicology report, which said that those people did not die the way it's claimed that they died. They didn't die on the spot from chlorine poisoning, and that was suppressed by the OPCW, and that's, you know, this propagandizing to try to bury the truth of Duma and what happened at Duma means that you're trying to bury the truth of how these civilians came to die. Now, we don't know how they came to die for sure at the moment, but what we do know is that it does not appear that they were killed by a chlorine gas attack at that location. So if that's the case, you've got, you know, this is not sort of, no one's claiming this is a faked event, that no one was killed. No, there are 50 civilians who were killed, and it's women and children. And there's photographs, and people can see them. And it's a question of how these people were killed. And it's very clear from the suppressed documentation from the OPCW investigation. It's very clear from the testimony of OPCW persons that investigation was nobbled. That the truth behind how those people have been killed has effectively been buried, and ultimately it's 50 people. That's potentially a major war crime that you have there. Maybe they were killed through some other means by accident, or maybe it's worse than that. But either way, if you're stopping preventing a proper investigation from occurring, and as is the case with the Duma investigation, you're stopping any ability to establish the truth of how these people were killed, how they died, and that, in my books, is effectively working to cover up a potential war crime. So that's the game that these people are engaged in. You know, people can laugh and joke about Bellingcat and how much nonsense and, you know, castigate them for getting so much media attention and so on. But what they're engaged in, and this is a point that was made by one of you earlier, they're engaged in is manufacturing consent, propagandizing, essentially for Western foreign policy. And Western foreign policy, as we all know, in the last 20 years has been characterized by a very high level of belligerence, arguably higher than in earlier decades in the 20th century. I mean, Vietnam was pretty bad, but it was extremely bad, but in Central America, but the kind of overt conflicts that you've had, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq, which rumble on to this day, this is Western foreign policy. Call it imperialism if you want, but it's Western foreign policy, and it is those policies which are incredibly damaging in terms of loss of life and destruction, which are enabled by these kind of activities. And well, so it's a serious and I think a criminal issue, to be quite honest, the way the kind of levels of propaganda that we've seen in the West, and those involved in propagating it.
Yeah, I agree, and there's significant overlap in terms of the playbook that's used, and even just sort of the rollout of narrative management in terms of the OPCW leaks, and for example, the 9/11 Commission report, and you see the same sort of denial and obfuscation, and then the attempt to discredit the individual rather than the information, with the film Seven and the NIST report, and then with the OPCW leaks themselves, and for how Mate gets treated when he comes out with accurate information, in the same way that A&E 9/11 gets treated when they come out and come forward with the University of Fairbanks study.
Yeah, I think that's a very good example to bring up. I mean, in a sense, the issue of the war on Syria, this is all in the broad context of the 9/11 global war on terror. All of these conflicts flowed out of this, and of course, as we know, that there are now very serious questions about 9/11 itself, and that's why, you know, as I've said publicly for many years, that these are questions which now have to be seriously looked at by academics and scholars. But the point you made is very apt. Is what you can see, and what I think the film Seven shows with Halsey's Alaska Fairbanks study, and then how it really, you know, drives a cart and horses through the NIST investigation into the building collapse. It just starts to show you quite how I think it's accurate to use the word corrupted rather than just biased. I think we have very corrupted institutions in the West, and you can see it with the NIST report, with the extraordinarily poor answers that they've been giving to the very legitimate questions being asked. And you see that, you know, and the questions which are raised in Seven, is it looks as though these people in this organization were under significant pressure to reach a particular conclusion. And yeah, I think this is the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in, politics and international politics, media and communications and so on, is it tells us that we're in very bad shape in democratic terms, right? That our institutions aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Journalists sit they're supposed to be doing, and out strategy. So you have people who shouldn't even be in these various positions, who appear to be and acting as essentially propagandists. And we've seen this, you know, across the board with COVID, and increasingly a lot of journalists in mainstream organizations saying, well, we know that we're not sort of really sort of telling the truth about things, but we're just, you know, everyone's got to stay with the line. And you're seeing it in the medical community as well. I've heard people from within the medical community saying, well, we just have to stay on message. You know, we're not, if people start to question what's going on, they run a risk of losing their jobs. So in a way, we've seen a lot of this almost coming to the surface, I think, with COVID, in terms of how scientists, universities, media absolutely get sort of pulled in contrails of agendas which are being pushed by very, very powerful actors. And what does it mean? It means that our democracies are not functioning, and just not functioning in the way that it's supposed to be functioning. And we have to all collectively, I think, start to work out ways of doing something about that, to get our democracies back. I think that's the obvious challenge that faces us now.
There's a lot of parallels you see in all of these events, in all of these just mass waves of propaganda, where you see a lot of lying by omission, like with the OPCW scandal. Not only did they repress the toxicology report, but they also repressed Ian Henderson's engineering report, which essentially concluded that that the cylinders were more likely to be manually placed there than dropped. And then with the 9/11 Commission, it was highlighted in the film Seven that the debris from Ground Zero was literally removed, so they couldn't test any of the corrosive agents that were left on that metal. And then you see today with COVID as well, you see any dissent within the medical community, the scientific community, just being shunned and shoved into a little corner of, oh, that's QAnon. And then it manufactures consent for them to be censored, for them to be ostracized from society, for no one to listen to them and no one to effectively hear them. And that's really where journalism failed, because you don't bring dissenting voices to the table. You don't challenge the official narrative. I've been kind of going back to this for the past couple of days now, because it's just such a glaring example of kind of the sad state of our press right now. But there was a press conference with Joe Biden's recent new press secretary, Jen Psaki. And in that press conference, she's saying, oh, yeah, this administration holds the First Amendment in incredibly high regard. We want to make sure that protecting press freedom is a high priority for us. And she's going on this whole tirade, this whole platitude tirade of how important the First Amendment and press freedom is for the Biden administration. And not one journalist in that room brings up Julian Assange. Not one journalist in that room brings up someone like Reality Winner or Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning or any of them. None of them can speak up for an award-winning journalist who's being tortured for exposing war crimes, a move that wasn't even made by the Obama administration. And you have to actively repress yourself to stay silent on Julian Assange if you're faced with someone in the Biden administration going on this platitude tirade about free press. And it's just so emblematic of the sad and pathetic and cowardly state of our media and how it's become an agent of Western propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, things look to me pretty extreme now, and I don't want to look back on the Vietnam War as some kind of golden era of American journalism, because it wasn't, and we know that the American media did a very bad job in that for a long time, but there were elements of independence that you could see at various points in Vietnam, right? You could see, Walter Cronkite's famous broadcast during the Tet Offensive, Seymour Hersh, My Lai Massacre, and so on. You saw these examples of independence emerging at some point in that conflict. And that indicated that there was a little bit of room for maneuver for journalists. And I think that's completely gone now. Things have got much, much worse now, and it's a much more extreme situation we're in, where I don't think the problem is so much, and this is how it was often described by people like Herman and Chomsky and other critical scholars in the 80s, that journalists just internalize a particular worldview and they come to believe that worldview, and that's why they don't ask difficult questions about various foreign policy issues. I don't think that's really the problem with what we have today. I think you have journalists straightforward know. This is what I suspect. They know that what they're saying is either highly inconsistent or probably not true, but they're just scared for their jobs. They don't want to lose their jobs. That is, and so they will not, as you just pointed, they will not raise the elephant in the room, Julian Assange. I mean, it's, they should be laughing. This happens in the UK as well, when the British foreign minister talks about press freedom in the world and so on, whilst they have Julian Assange locked up in a prison. The fact that you can say those things and people don't simply laugh you out of the room for your double standard is extraordinary. And to me, it can only mean that the journalists, they know this, they know they can't go there, and they're either not very nice people and are just going with power, or some of them probably fit that mold, but others are just scared. They just know that if I go there, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to have a sea of pain if I start to raise that issue. And I think that's gripping them in a powerful way. Dan Rather, he was talking about the Iraq invasion 2003, or the period between 9/11 and the Iraq invasion, and he was saying, I think in a film produced by John Pilger, The War You Don't See, but he was just talking about how in the newsroom, he said that the fear of being called a traitor or unpatriotic as something you get tarred with, and it will stay with you for the rest of that fear, he said, is in the minds of every journalist. And this is back in 2002. And I think that maybe gives an insight into what we're seeing today. So journalists know if they speak up about Assange, what will they be tarred with? You're simply a Putinist, you're a Russian propagandist. That line's always been pushed towards WikiLeaks for some time now, and being essentially tarred. And I think they're scared of that. And I have to admit, I've got direct experience of it with journalists and actually other academics in relation to the Syria issue. As I'm sure you all know, and others, Vanessa and Aaron Mate and Max Blumenthal, others who have spoken objectively or critically about Syria, suffer huge volumes of attack. I know from an American celebrity who I won't name, but he's very high profile, described when this person raised the issue of Syria, they'd never experienced such a level, such a ferocity of attacks over social media, over any other issue, and so on. So this is why I think journalists in the newsroom, it is terrifying. If I cover that issue, if I go there, then I'm going to be closed down. And I don't think that in any way it helps us to understand why they act in the way they do. It obviously doesn't justify it. Right? As you all know, you've got to say to yourself at some point in a job, well, why am I doing this job? And if you're a journalist and you can't really report on the most important things or the truth, then what's your point? Same goes for academics as well. If you can't study and write about the issues which you think are important because you're too scared or etc., or you're scared of the attacks you might get, then you're self-censoring and you're not really doing your job. You're better off going and helping old people in an old people's home than pretending to be an academic or pretending to be a journalist.
This is what makes people like Tariq Haddad such exemplary individuals, because it's funny when Tariq first left Newsweek, he came on the Free Assange Vigil. We got to know him, and his first couple of interviews, especially like that one that he did with George Galloway, were right after it happened, where he's trying to be like super polite to the institution and trying so hard to be like, no, I just want to make it perfectly clear that this isn't all journalists and this is my story and I'm telling you it from my perspective. From that to where he is now with after like covering the Assange trial as in depth as he had and wading into that whole world coming from Newsweek, he's now like it's radicalized him
Yeah.
to a degree, just to see what kind of pushback he got from his own peers and from the people that 2 weeks prior were trying to make sure that he was like the brown guy that they knew when they went out to the pub. And like these are his words, by the way. This is him explaining it to me, but yeah, he went from being used as like token person of color at social events to target of smears by the exact same people, and it has like it's put him more in journalism is an adversarial weapon category now, as opposed to I would like to report the facts as the facts come in.
It's I do suspect that all of this cannot carry on for an awful lot longer. I mean, this point about things having become more extreme now in terms of the way the media is operating, its proximity to power, it's worse than it was, say, 20 years, 30 years ago. And the absurdity, the point about the Biden press conference, the absurdity when you have journalists, sort of not challenging an official on when they're talking about press freedom, that's becoming so obvious, I think, and I suspect that COVID-19, and there are signs that is coming off the rails in important ways. This kind of awareness that the media isn't really operating the way it should be, I think, is expanding. It has continued to expand for a long time. I don't know whether this figure was correct. I picked it up from a tabloid paper, but it's something about half of the British public don't want to pay their license fee anymore for the BBC. I do know that trust levels in Western mainstream media are at historically low levels. All the figures show that, and so I think in the 70s, CBS was 70% of the American public thought CBS was pretty trustworthy. It's now down to 30%. So you have got this dramatic collapse in public faith in the mainstream media, and critically for very good reasons, because they've been doing an increasingly bad job. And I think that creates potential for something new to emerge at some point. Whether it's through alternative independent media or whether it's through a much broader based, and that's what I think we need now, political movement that starts to address the problems we have with our democracies. Ranging from everything from the mainstream media through to our political establishment, which is not by any measure independent of economic power, for example. It's an easy target, isn't it, the American political system, with how money works in Congress, but it's the same in Europe, right? It's you have institutions which are corrupted, and so I think that these things with the media, I just don't know how much longer they can really carry on. I think if COVID-19 starts to fully unravel, and if you have a situation where people recognize that this was obviously the wrong thing to do, and there's a whole load of agendas being pushed here as well, if that does come to pass, and people are going to be looking back and thinking, I was sitting and listening to the BBC for 6 months, and they just told me one version of events for 6 months. I got pummeled with it, and people that's going to be a powerful loss of trust, I think, if COVID-19 unravels. I have a sibling, a relative, who said, well, I always watch BBC News, but after COVID-19, within about 2 weeks, I'd switched off, and I realize now that there are problems with these media outlets in a way that I had never recognized that before. And I think a lot of people, more than ever, are realizing that. Although things are bad and we're in a crisis, maybe it's darkest just before the dawn, and maybe at some point in the coming years.
I feel like the story coming out of New York that Governor Cuomo had deliberately misled misled. Don't you love that? That he had deliberately sold his own constituents a barrel of lies about the nursing home body count. I believe that might be, I hope it might be sort of the the crack that breaks the dam as far as the COVID narrative goes, because this is a story that, like, some of us had been talking about since last year when the initial report came out, and there was an inquiry that was made out of one of the assemblyman's districts, but it was specifically about the nursing homes back in like May of last year. And it got reported on in June. Jason Burmis and a couple of us picked it up and talked about it. And now we're, getting close to a year later, and it's starting to come out. It's almost the same way that the OPCW did, really, where there were only a few of us initially that when it happened that were like, hey, something's really fishy about the story coming out. Maybe we should stay on top of it. And then we were smeared as conspiracy theorists for about a year. And then the report came out. It's about where we are with COVID. And I mean, I hope and am doing whatever I can do to get, as accurate information as we've found out about it. But it takes like a just massive rapid unraveling in real time of something like this before the mainstream public picks up on it. And I think something as just grossly inept as Cuomo's mishandling of this may be the thing that starts a more rational conversation about COVID going forward.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with COVID-19, and I think I wrote a piece for Off Guardian at the start of this thing, talking about, is COVID-19, is it the sort of new 9/11 in terms of, how it might play out and what it might be used for, and I think that parallel is there, but I think COVID-19 is on a much bigger scale, and it's also on a scale which, everybody, wars in Afghanistan, Syria, only a certain section of the population pay much attention at, and that goes for the OPCW sort of issue area. And even for questions around 9/11, these are things which people can readily disengage from in their everyday lives. COVID-19 isn't that. It's affecting everyone directly, immediately, in powerful ways, and so on. So everyone's aware of what's going on, and everyone's focused on it, and everyone's directly impacted. And so in that sense, the way in which COVID-19, the kind of propaganda or the political dimensions of it, for anyone who's pushing, for example, who's been pushing for lockdown, who is pushing for a particular response to COVID-19, for those people who have been building the narrative, I think it's quite clear, and we all know what WEF's view on the whole thing is. We all know what Bill Gates' view on the whole thing is. He thinks we should all be locked up for a couple of years and everyone's got to be vaccinated, etc. But for these groups who are pushing a very particular narrative, this issue can really come apart badly for them, potentially. And certainly in Europe and in the UK, you do have substantial elements of the mainstream media who are pushing back. And so in the United Kingdom, you've had the Mail on Sunday and Peter Hitchens in particular questioning COVID, the lockdown strategy. But it's actually much broader than that. There are significant elements, as it were, even within the elite structure, who are pushing back. And it's the same in Germany now, in fact. Developed on Sunday, the World on Sunday published more material today, which was identifying essentially sort of people involved in really ratcheting up the fear levels in order to justify lockdown and being reported critically. And this newspaper was also criticizing other German media for not asking tougher questions earlier on. And and that's quite important, and I think that what that shows you is that this thing does have the potential to unravel. The New York Cuomo example, I read about that today actually. That there is a sense in which the COVID-19 response, which, I mean, I've been normally quite careful. I think originally at the start I was thinking, well, I'm not a scientist who works in epidemiology, so I can't say for sure. What I can say now as a citizen and as a father and as a husband of somebody who works in a school, I absolutely am clear in my mind that lockdown strategies are wrong. They do more damage than good. They're wrong on so many different levels, and I, as a citizen, am thoroughly opposed to it. I'm quite happy to say that in public, etc. And I think that will. I hope and that will build, or there is at least a potential for that to now build. And you know what? If it does get successfully established as the consensus view, the people who are advocating and pushing for these policies are going to fall very hard, very, very hard. We already know that there is these big legal processes. Was it Rainer Fulmich, the German lawyer, with the PCR lawsuits, and I understand that there's lots of lawsuits going on. You can see this being an absolute car crash for those people who pushed for extraordinary measures. We've never locked down societies to deal with a respiratory virus in the whole of history. This is not how we've dealt with these things. So, we'll see. We've got to see how it goes. We've got a long fight ahead of us with all of it. But there is certainly not. Okay, somebody who's been working on the OPCW issue and Syria and war and 9/11 war on terror, getting people to be interested in those issues is quite a challenge beyond certain circles. But that's not the case with COVID-19. Everyone cares about COVID-19 because everyone's lives are very immediately affected by it. And if, as I suspect, that the policies which have dominated have been profoundly wrong and have probably done a huge amount of harm, then there's going to be, I think, in time, potentially at least, a lot of people asking for accountability and justice over this, and also hopefully people thinking, well, maybe we do have a bigger problem with our institutions than I previously realized.
Man, I hope so.
I mean, there is an element of indication, right, for people like us who have argued for a long time that the media doesn't do the job it's supposed to do, that our governments do bad things, they're not benign, etc. We've been saying this for years and pointing this out, and you get accused of being conspiracy theorists and all that kind of thing. But there's a potential for a lot more people to realize that governments, for a whole variety of reasons, including nefarious ones, but also incompetence, it varies from case to case, but our governments don't get it right and always do the right thing. And actually, I'd argue most of the time they're not doing the right thing. But you know what I mean? That naivety that you have, I mean, in a sense, in my view, it's the kind of liberal center, the neoliberal center of gravity of political forces in the West. This kind of naivety that many of them have, that we're great, we don't do any harm, is something which I think can really be properly put to bed following COVID if things do unravel.
It's a naivety that's like wrapped around in this smug assuredness.
Yeah.
That,
an echo chamber, pretty much.
And I think what it comes, or a lot of times what it comes down to, because I don't want to paint it with too broad a brush or speak in absolutes about this, but in a lot of ways, it comes down to people don't want to admit that they've been duped, and they would rather hold on to a bad idea than admit that they got played by, not just by like a news story, but by these institutions, behind the story, and walking away from that kind of worldview. To many people, it's akin to having to shed their entire identity.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to some of the earlier points you were making, Piers, just about kind of really being able to start fixing and reviving our media's corpse and trying to really change our Western political institutions. I think that's one of the things that I see as a real strength as the movement to free Julian Assange, is because it's like, not only is it about securing Julian's freedom first and foremost, but it's also this really post-partisan movement to begin to just revive what's left of journalism, what's left of free speech, trying to highlight real investigative journalism, and trying to stand against as well this image of just like, yeah, powerhouse democracy that's put forward by Western nations, and trying to hold them accountable for literal war crimes that WikiLeaks exposed. And I think that's one of the things that I find really unique about the Free Assange movement, is it goes really beyond one man, and it gets at this post-partisan movement, which starts challenging political institutions in the West and wants to bring back journalism, wants to bring back investigative journalism and a type of scientific journalism which can challenge the establishment. And kind of going off that note of the Assange movement, we also had a question from the chat. Marty O asked, how do you see the establishment in the United Kingdom dealing with Assange? And then he brings up the fact that the ICC won't prosecute the UK for war crimes. And then when the ICC starts flirting with actually beginning to hold people accountable for war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan, then they get sanctioned by the US Secretary of State. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that point is correct. I mean, Assange is an important symbol of the importance of freedom of speech, the importance of journalism to Western, to any society, but in particular to democratic societies, and the fact that he's incarcerated is a symbol of what a desperate state we're in, and saving him and saving what he stood for is part of saving ourselves and saving our democracies, and so it's very extremely important. This issue about the ICC and the British establishment, I mean, again, and this is parallel with the OPCW, is that what this tells us is that these institutions, these organizations, are not independent of power. And this is very clear with the OPCW and its investigation of the alleged chemical weapons attacks in Syria. It has been effectively that element of the OPCW. It's not the whole OPCW, it's the element, the fact-finding missions dealing with Syria have been corrupted by British, French, and American intelligence, or governments, foreign services, okay, in order to derive certain results. So, I mean, for example, actually, I won't go into the details because listeners won't know, but that's an example, and with the ICC, that the institutions and with the British justice system, I mean, what kind of justice is there operating in relation to Julian Assange? I mean, seriously. This is ridiculous. This is not justice. Do you know what, you can say the same about the person who's been held in Guantanamo Bay waiting prosecution or a trial on 9/11. This is 20 years.
Yeah.
This isn't justice. This highlights the state that the West is in, and I think it's making this, you know, these things which, you know, if you can bring them into the view of the point you're making earlier about the liberals whose identity is underpinned by the system is working and it's good, you bring these things to these people and they can't compute them initially. and so on. But at some point, I think they will. I think they'll wake up to this and realize quite how bad a state we're in.
Well, we see the same processes play out in terms of narrative management around 9/11 and OPCW, and even to an extent Julian Assange, where there's a conclusion that that power wants people to come to. Like the conclusion is, for example, Assad gassed his own people. So the way that the report gets built then is that the conclusion has been predetermined. Assad gassed his own people. 19 Saudi hijackers flew planes into the towers. Julian Assange guilty. That's the predetermined conclusion. So then all of the investigation is built with supporting that conclusion in mind, and any evidence to the contrary is then pushed to the side or suppressed or outright ignored. And so when you deliver your final report, all of the work that you did leading up to it that has been leaked out to support it becomes woven into the fabric of reality, and then it becomes our job in the independent media and as people who are critical thinkers and well, I guess thought influencers. We have to not only combat the rewriting of history, but the rewriting of real time as it comes at us. Which makes this job interesting, to say the least.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
It's challenging with the level of propaganda that there is. I mean, I think the point for me, the point you raise is this, which is something which is in a sense I've talked about before, is what we need from people in terms of how they engage this level of propaganda and these very concerted drives. As you say, you have a preordained conclusion. Iraq's got to have WMD, Syria's got to be gassing its own people. So all of these things have and then you can you pressure the organizations and institutions and you get them to feed the right story out to the public. How do you combat that? I mean, one of the most important ways, I think, is, as well as having brave, courageous people, whether whistleblowers or independent journalists like yourselves who are challenging things, is for people to develop the skills of critical thinking, media literacy, to understand more about how the media operates, how information operates, and to think for themselves. And my suspicion is that in Western society, and I think you see it to an extent in the education system, is that we have pulled our education of children away from a degree of getting them to think for themselves, and pushed them towards sort of jumping through hoops. And actually, from my personal experience as a lecturer in the university, I noticed from '99 through to sort of the late 2019, sort of the shift in students, from students who were sort of more independent minded to ones who are sort of coming into my office saying, I just want to know how to get a first, just tell me how to do it. And sort of and you want to sort of say to them, well, expand your mind, sort of enjoy university, etc., and also use this to develop. And well, no, I don't want to do that, I just want to know how to get a first, and so on. And I think you see that in the education system to an extent, certainly in Britain, but maybe across the West. And what we're not doing is raising our younger generation to think for themselves, to have confidence in their own ability, in their own judgment. That's one of the most extraordinary things I've found talking to some mainstream journalists about issues related to Syria and the OPCW, is how gobsmackingly naive they are. And I remember sort of talking to one journalist, and the journalist said, "Well, I would never have thought to question the OPCW." And this is a political journalist at a high-profile European newspaper. And I thought, this is incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
sort of, you should be using your own. You do not just trust people. It's not our job to believe our government. It's our job as citizens to question our government and say, right, you're telling me this. You need to make the point. And we just, this is one of the things that we can do, and powerful, mobilizing things we can do, I think, is to encourage people to get back to this. How do you argue rationally? How do you look at evidence? How do you think for yourself? And also, and I'm a great believer in this, trust in your own intelligence. Some of the, as it were, some of the stupidest people you have are the extremely highly educated, there were liberals who believe they know everything about the world, and they actually know nothing at all. And some of the smartest people you find is you get into a cab and the cabbie's talking to you, and you suddenly realize that they're slightly ahead of the game compared to you in relation to a whole number of issues. And I've had that on quite a few occasions, especially sort of on sort of issues in relation to 9/11 and questions of, well, the official story is clearly incorrect. And, the response you get from the cabbie is, oh, I've known that for years, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's quite remarkable that people do. There is that innate intelligence, I think, for people to be able to look at these issues and just think for themselves. And that's what we need. We need people. Democracies don't survive if you don't have active citizenry who think for themselves and question all the time. If you stop doing that, then power takes over.
So
one of the
So one of the things that I always found interesting, because I'm actually a junior in college right now, and to make it even better, I'm an international relations major. One of the things I always found interesting was the emphasis on secondary sources over primary sources, because we'll be expected to come up with like policy papers on different countries and different international security issues. And the requirements will be something like, oh, you need like 7 secondary sources or something like that. Nothing about WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks is typically looked down upon in international relations academia, which is just absolutely asinine to me. And primary sources in general are often shied away from. It's like they would rather you source your information from like some like pundit Mick Esquire Jr. the Fifth versus a leaked email from from Cablegate, which is, a diplomat's own words, or from one of the OPCW reports that was that was suppressed, or like a Vanessa Beeley interview with a Syrian on the ground in person. It's like they would rather have you take some old, out of touch academic's word for it than being able to have the resources right in front of you and formulate the answer for yourself. It's like WikiLeaks is 100% true primary resources. That should be an international relations teacher like dream, like perfect. Like, you want a 100% true source? Go to WikiLeaks. Like use the OPCW reports for your policy paper on Syria. Use the Cablegate emails for your policy paper on Iran, or in detailing the overreach of Shell in Nigeria, or anything like that. And it's generally frowned upon in academia, and that's why they're a part of the Mickey Mac complex, the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia think tank complex. And it forms this whole thing, and it baffles me sometimes how how not you, of course, but like how most professors shy away from primary resources and from wanting students to gather them themselves.
Yeah. I'm so glad you tell me you're an international relations student, and you have my sympathy.
You have mine too.
My background is international relations. My undergraduate degree was government politics, and then master's in international relations, and then my PhD was international politics, and I guess a lot of my publications are in the world of international relations scholarship. I mean, of academic disciplines, I mean, IR I think is notorious. It's maybe slightly better than political science in general, but there's been a long-running sort of internal dialogue about the proximity of that discipline to political power. Where it's revolving doors, which you see in America and so on, between academia and the American political establishment. But the discipline, you're absolutely right. I mean, I as I say, operated for 20 years, and I suppose I would still want to try to contribute to it in some ways, in the coming years. But it's a remarkably stifled environment, and I suppose I remember somebody when I was at Manchester University said to me that there's a reason why we call these things academic disciplines, because it is about disciplining people to think in particular ways, to ask some questions and not to ask other questions. And if I was to be brutally honest, my feeling is that having gone through academia and as it were, through a PhD and then through being an academic, publishing, etc., to where I am now, I almost feel I sort of had a period of sort of learning the discipline, becoming disciplined, descending into the depths, and then probably about halfway through that period, of then sort of struggling to get back up to the surface, and to get back to where I think I am now. And I think that if you follow me, there's a tremendous amount of training of the mind that goes on in universities. I mean, I wrote a piece with a colleague in 2003 about Noam Chomsky's propaganda model and how that applies to universities as well. The propaganda model of mass media that all works with academia. And I think when I wrote it, objectively, I kind of thought, yeah, sort of this makes sense, but I didn't quite believe it. I thought, no, I'm quite independent as an academic. But now I think that it's worse than I thought, that I objectively thought it was back in 2003. People are very powerfully constrained. Their minds are disciplined. And this is one of the points about academia. Academia is just not independent enough of political power or financial strains. And look, I know this. I mean, and I'm guilty of this, as self-censorship. I mean, I think it took me about 10 years teaching international politics to be confident to start to lecture, for example, a little bit about the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the reason was you're just terrified of upsetting somebody and then incurring the wrath of complaints and so on, or he criticized Israel and then he fear of anti-Semitism and so on charge, and those things are really alive in the mind of academics across a whole range of issue areas. And I have to admit, if for any student going through the process of just keep in mind what I've just said as an academic who's been through it. There are certain skills you learn which are useful as an academic and which do allow you to analyze objectively. But that thing you alluded to, this kind of what's legitimate and what isn't legitimate, is so central to these disciplines in a way that they're taught, and mean that these disciplines aren't really properly. It's not about independent thinking. So I've heard an academic saying that apparently Bellingcat is being referred to by some academics as well. Use Bellingcat.
Is this something that happens? Is this something that happens from the administrative level, or is this just you get into kind of a groupthink situation and then you don't want to upset the apple cart, as it were? Like because I don't know at all. And the last PhD we had on the show was Cynthia McKinney, and she wasn't allowed to teach anywhere in the West. She had to go to Bangladesh in order to get a university job. And so I don't know how narrative management works in academia, and I'm fascinated by dissecting it, because I do feel like it could help incoming college students and other. We have a number of people on the show that are in academia, but more at like the TA level, or just starting out, or like Glory, who are the undergraduate students.
Well, first of all, I think an initial introduction. I mean, go and read this piece I wrote in the Review of International Studies in 2003 on Noam Chomsky and foreign policy in academia, and the point made there is that the filters which apply to the mainstream media, reliance upon official sources, ideology, all of those things are at work in universities, and so academics rely upon, access to sources in IR and politics and so on, funding streams to universities, big grants coming from industry to look at particular things. All of these things have a powerful effect and constrain what people do. And that's part of the story. I mean, another part of the story is the way in which the disciplines operate, and this kind of, being seen as an acceptable, this person is an acceptable kind of academic. They're thinking and researching areas which are okay. And I think there's a lot of selection that goes on, and I can never be sure, but I've always had my suspicions throughout my academic career as to academics who are in quite important, powerful positions, and who do a little bit of a kind of a gatekeeping, sort of in conference circuits, exactly where their loyalties ultimately are. Sort of, are these academics, as you had in the Cold War, who have good relationships with the intelligence services? So, I mean, there's probably elements of that, as there is with the mainstream media going on. And I think that's important. But if you want if you want to learn about, or just to talk to other people about how it might work in academia, just look at what's happened to me and my colleagues who have looked at Syria. I mean, we come from a range of different positions. In the Syria working group, where there's an epidemiologist and various disciplines involved, but basically we started to look closely at the chemical weapons initiative in Syria. We were aware already at that point that there was elements of the British Foreign Office, etc., who were connected with it. So we were aware that we were treading over an active propaganda operation in a major war. And then look what happened. Look what has happened to us. I mean, sort of, I think when the Duma event happened, we were then. I mean, I think I did do an interview on Sky News where I raised a question. I said, well, I'm not quite sure who carried out this attack, and the person I was set up against got very angry and lost his cool that I should even suggest that it might not have been the Syrian government. But there was then exactly as Britain, America, and France was bombing Syria, the Times newspaper had a front page article attacking us, the Syria Working Group, as Assadists. This is as the time that the aircraft were going off to bomb. And it wasn't just front page hit piece, they had an editorial on us, and they had two other articles and pictures in the newspaper. And then that has carried on. I mean, our working group, or people connected with it, there's been at least 20 articles across Huffington Post and the Times newspaper attacking us as Assad apologists, as this, as that, etc. And of course, other academics can see this happening. And when you actually look at what we're doing and what we're saying, I mean, we're all sort of fairly reputable, etc., in our fields, and we're not even saying particularly. I mean, there are some academics out there who say some pretty wild things, but we're just talking objectively and what the evidence is, say, in relation to Syria, and you're just getting a deluge of mainstream media attacks, and other academics see that, and of course that has a powerful disciplining effect. They're thinking, am I going to open my mouth about Syria now? Probably.
Is there an academic term for a society that treats asking objective questions as a treason?
I'm not sure. Maybe there is, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Because it seems like that's where we're at. right now. We're even not even suggesting possible alternative answers, but merely asking objective questions is being treated as a form of treason. And I don't really know how to rationally push back against that. You know, I really don't. Like, it's my initial response is to scream obscenities and ask someone what's wrong with them as I shake them.
Yeah. Well, what we absolutely need. So, I mean, just going back to my point is that this is one of the ways it works. Academics kind of like know what they don't want is to end up on the front page of the Times newspaper. And what they don't want is to have, one of the attack dog columnists like Oliver Cam pursuing you relentlessly and hurling abuse. He said a very unpleasant thing about me on Twitter the other day, and where he's blocked me, so difficult for me to reply, etc. But academics don't want that, and the universities don't want that, because the first response of university hierarchy to these attacks is not, "You're a brave academic, well done." It's more of a kind of, okay, how do we calm this down? And what you need from universities and what you need in society is an absolutely robust defense of principles of academic freedom and freedom of expression. And as you suggested, this is what's suffering badly in the West at the moment, whether it's what we've seen with the tech giant censorship on COVID-19 related issues, and this emerging as this kind of the domestic war on terror in America, where you're so extremism is being associated with terrorism. Okay, and we've had this in Britain with the prevent policy, where targeting views which are deemed as extreme and then associating it with terrorism, something which is illegal. And that conflation, and of course, you point out, you say, well, the suffragettes were called extremists and so on. Black civil rights movements were called extremists and terrorists. You need to make sure that you do defend people and allow people to express without attaching those labels. And we're just struggling at the moment in the West. I think universities are very weak at defending the principles of free speech. And there is a campaign in the UK at the moment in relation to this. But it's one of the things that we're losing. Possibly lost, but certainly losing, and that's core to our society, to democracy. Is if you go back to Mills, if you can't have all opinions expressed, then you can never be sure that you've rationally considered and weighed up the various arguments, and you always run the possibility of excluding that opinion that turns out to be correct. I mean, this isn't complicated in terms of democratic theory. And ultimately universities are terrified of the bad press, and so they're terrified of academics who are controversial. But of course, academics who are often controversial, they're just simply controversial because they're raising serious questions about corruption in their own society. And this is the issue with Syria. The reason why I think the academics, the working group, and others connected with us have been attacked so relentlessly is because we're just treading all over an active FCO propaganda operation in Syria. By the way, we know more. We'll be publishing more on it. We know the people who set it up. And
I look forward to that.
Who've been directly involved in it. And it's a propaganda operation which has underpinned a dirty war in Syria. That's the kind of the worrying part of it, is that groups we've been backing, by and large, have not been very nice groups. We've seen this before, of course, in Central America, South America, Afghanistan, etc., back into Vietnam. But that's what we're treading all over with the work that we're doing, and so that they're pulling out every last bit of ammunition they've got to try to discredit and to smear and so on, and all of that has a disciplining effect on what people think they can do. And universities, like all big institutions, they're pretty obsessed with PR, and they don't. I don't think they do recognize. It's difficult for me to say, really, because I think when I was at Sheffield, for example, I know that line is always put out by people attacking me. I was fired from Sheffield, but I wasn't. In fact, I left for reasons which were nothing to do with that. For combination of personal and health reasons, I left Sheffield. But so the university was sort of. I don't think they would ever have dared even question sort of my continuation because of the attacks that were occurring. But at the same time, you don't feel that there's this kind of well done, you stood up for yourself kind of encouragement. And I think most academics who are caught in controversial issues generally have the same experience. There's a kind of, what universities want is positive news. They want sort of positive stories about, the mating habits of squirrels, that kind of thing, the stuff which goes down well with the newspapers. That's the kind of stuff they love. And if you've got somebody who's, pushing really important, groundbreaking but controversial work, it's like, well, we don't really, can't we go back to the squirrels kind of thing?
Right. Show us the study that proves that Kansas is actually flatter than a pancake. Let's talk about that for 6 months. No, yeah. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and I want to thank you for that. We do need to wrap up here soonish. Aside from the new report, do you have anything else that's coming out that you would like to direct the audience towards, or anything in particular that you would like to let us know about?
Well, I think work on the OPCW and Syria issue. I mean, that issue is ongoing, and I think more material, not to do with us, but I think material will be coming out in relation to that publicly in the coming months, is my understanding. And also, we're doing our own work. We will be publishing a briefing note on other elements of the FCO propaganda operation in Syria. So that's important. The working group on 9/11 war on terror, I mean, that's really just sort of formed, but we're going to hopefully try to set up a conference on that at some point. But we will be sort of issuing a newsletter soon and trying to sort of work out sort of where we can be productive on that front. But I think that for me, the main focus at the moment is the OPCW issue. I mean, just to, this is not just about one chemical attack at Douma. This is an issue. The entire Syrian war has been dominated by a very high level of propaganda. The chemical weapons narrative issue is a little bit like the Iraq WMD scandal, except on a much higher level, much longer term, and involving actual events on the ground and so on. So that's a very big issue, and so on. And I think sort of as time goes on, more will come out on that. But that's the most important sort of main sort of research area at the moment. We should be putting material out on about, and and otherwise, I think the Organisation for Propaganda Studies is still a fledgling organisation, but boy, do we have a lot of work to do and material to get focused on with what we've just seen in the last year of COVID-19. I've never seen so many mainstream critical journalists now talking about propaganda and levels of propaganda. So that's something which we really need to start to build when we can move on from sort of focusing on Syria. So lots of things, hopefully.
Well, I commend you for your courage and your dedication on this. I know it's not easy to stick your neck out, especially when it comes to something like a false flag and war crime, and it's never easy to be on the, I guess, unofficial side of that story. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for spending time with us. Guys, it is let's see, I have the website up. Your Piers Robinson at WordPress, the blog, where did it go? I have it. There it is.
It's in the description.
PiersRobinson.wordpress.com. I will make sure that link gets stuck in the chat again before we split. And let's see, we'll be back at 3 Pacific, 6 on the East Coast with Zach, the Unfit Statesman. Tomorrow we have an exclusive interview with Johnny Vedmore, who just dropped an incredible piece on Klaus Schwab and his backstory and his family, and it should surprise everyone that Papa was a Nazi. Yeah, Papa was a Nazi. Klaus Schwab was actually involved in the illegal sale of nuclear weapons manufacturing material to apartheid South Africa, which I did not know until Johnny's just really groundbreaking report. So we've got that exclusive, and make sure you're there for that. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do that on Rockfin only, just to make everyone go get that account. Which, by the way, if you haven't got your free Rockfin account, please go do that, because that's where we'll be when YouTube arbitrarily removes our channel. I love you guys. Thank you for hanging out. Thanks again to Dr. Piers Robinson, my better than your co-host, Glory Jones. I will give you an extensive closeout on the thing, but I got to run. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just no hard feelings.
Always Sleepy Josh on the ones and twos. We will see you guys in a few hours. Until then, good luck to us all.
Love y'all.